Well, first of all, let me say hello to all of you, wherever you may be, what corner of the world. And I think we all are extremely aware that we are in very challenging times with many threats to the existence of the human species, from the pandemic, famine, war danger, and many things like that, like hyperinflationary developments. So therefore, I want to focus on the most important topic for today, which is, what underlies all of the different subjects one could discuss. And that is actually, what is the nature of man? What is the identity of man in the universe? And what is life all about? Why do we exist? Now, these are questions which normally have been discussed in the past by religions, by philosophies, by philosophers, by poets. And today, the whole question has basically been reduced to two fundamentally opposing views of what is man. On the one side, you have the almost dominant, at least in certain countries, dominant view that man is a parasite, that man burdens nature, that he has a CO2 footprint, which makes him a trouble to Mother Earth, and therefore, he endangers the planet. On the other side, you have the idea that man is the most advanced existence in the universe, that man is limitless, perfectible, that the world is in a systemic change, a tectonic change, and the outcome of which will be determined which of the two views will prevail. Now, it is obviously not an easy situation for a young person. I mean, if you are now 20 years or even 30 years and you have been born in the United States or Europe or a developing country, depending which country you are from, it's very different. But essentially, I can say that almost sure you have never experienced what is a good government. If you are about 20, you have been born in 2001. That was the day of the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. And then you had 8 years of the Bush administration, 8 years of the Obama administration, 4 years of Trump, and simultaneously, if you were in Germany, you had 16 years of Chancellor Merkel, a time of complete stagnation. In this whole period, you had 20 years of a war in Afghanistan, and now you see what these 20 years resulted in, that namely this period of the endless wars is ended. And, with what? An incredible experience where the most powerful military force in the world, that of the United States and NATO countries, could not win in 20 years against 65 Taliban fighters. Now that has left a complete vacuum in the strategic situation. And naturally, all these other endless wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, Latin America, in Africa, you were plagued with incredible poverty. The effects of the pandemic were devastating. You had mass migration. In many countries, the drug lobby or the drug producers and drug mafias are running the country. And if you look at the recent figures of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, 60% of all jobs worldwide are in the shadow economy, which means that people have been living from the hand to the mouth. And how fragile our world is has become very clear during the pandemic. Now, you have been also told by the mass media and most politicians that Russia, China are autocratic states which, there is no freedom and no liberty. Well, if you look around the world, we are actually in a horrendous situation. There are more than 820 million people who are undernourished, who go to bed hungry every day. That means, every 10th person is not having enough food. 1 million dies of hunger every month. 2 billion people have no access to clean water. And the head of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, has been saying many times in the recent months that we are in front of a hunger catastrophe, which is already going on, of biblical dimension, he said. Now, so basically, these incredible informations about, almost 1 billion people going hungry, it may catch the headlines for a day, but then, it's forgotten again and nothing happens. Is there any change? The G20 would immediately organize an emergency summit saying this is intolerable, we have all the technologies, we could change that, we could start an immediate humanitarian airlift to the southern hemisphere, we could double the food production, we could make sure that not one child is going hungry anymore within a few months. We are calling upon the farmers of the world to double the food production, which they easily could do. Well, obviously, nothing of this is happening. Then, if you look at the US-Mexico border, where recently 15,000 people were gathering under this bridge and then were chased away, basically with whips and with devices worse than during the time of slavery. Look at the Mediterranean. This is not any better. Over the last several years, hundreds of thousands of people have tried to flee from hunger in Southwest Asia, in Africa. And the border organization of the European Union, Frontex, they are now in front of a court trial because they were involved and condoned pushback operations. That is what they call that, which is driving the refugees back into the water, with an uncertain possibility to survive. This has been happening in the recent time in Greece, on the islands in Croatia. And if you look at this incredible condition, what is the reaction of the population in the United States or in Western or in European countries? Do they go on the streets and say, we want justice for all of these incredible situations because it would be so easy to remedy it? No, nothing of this sort is happening. Okay, during the pandemic, people got a little bit upset because they were deprived of their usual kind of life. But in general, they were quite indifferent to the suffering in Africa and Latin America, in Iraq or Afghanistan or Haiti. And I think it's not wrong to say that what characterizes the outlook of most people in the United States and in Europe, probably other places in Asia as well, I come to that later on, you could characterize as depraved indifference. An indifference against the suffering of people which reflects on the depraved character of those who are not acting. Now, this is basically all the result of a deliberate policy. This is not a natural catastrophe. This is actually something which my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, was warning against in 1971, when he said that if the IMF would continue to push their policy of monetarist austerity, that you would see practically pandemics erupting, you would see mass genocide. And the condition of the developing countries, for the most part, is the result of first a colonial policy and then the continuation of that policy by the IMF, the World Bank, and the leading financial institutions of this world. It is a cold-blooded policy to keep the markets happy, and the governments have long become the servants of these financial institutions. Now, it is a complete lack of empathy, because otherwise this would not exist for about 50 years. It is in general a lack of interest to even find out about it on the side of the general population. And now, since about 2 years, we have an escalation of this policy in the West. It's called shifting the trillions. This was a decision made by the top central bankers and leading bankers in August 2019 at their annual meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where they decided on a regime change to shift the power not any longer being in the hands of governments, but that the central banks should determine essentially not only the monetary policy, but also the fiscal policy, with other words, the budgets and how investments occur in general. It was called Shifting the Trillions. There is actually a very interesting paper with their title, which people should really read. Then these policies were announced with different names by the World Economic Forum of Davos. It was called the Great Reset, the Green Deal, the Green New Deal in the United States. The Biden administration just announced a US executive order whereby all investments have to go into green technologies. Even earlier, Joachim Schellenhuber talked about the great transformation of the world economy, the decarbonization, basically saying that all fossil fuels and related industries are out. You all have to go into renewables. Mostly nuclear energy is not regarded as a green technology, even so there is some debate about that. And now all of this has to be finalized by the great COP26 summit in Glasgow, which starts, interestingly, on Halloween, the 31st of October. And therefore, a period comes to a head which was announced by Prince Charles in 2019, when he then announced that the world has only 18 months left to save the planet. Now, naturally, the Friday for Future and Greta Thunberg had said that, there are only 12 years left, of which now 2 years have passed already. But what Prince Charles meant was that there were only 3 major summits which absolutely had to accomplish this transformation, or it would be too late. The first being the World Food Summit, then the Biodiversity Summit, and culminating now with COP26 in Glasgow, where actually all legislation and all governments had to be sworn in to go for this great reset. Now, all is in the name of stopping climate change. Now, that is actually quite absurd. Anybody who has ever looked into climate science, which is very complicated and involves many, many different areas of natural science, you find out that the climate is changing since millions of years. And, that has to do with the position of our Milky Way in the galaxy. It has to do with processes on the sun. It has to do with cosmic radiation. And now, in the name of protecting the climate, they are now pushing actually the biggest deception operation in history. Because it has nothing to do with the real reasons of climate change. The leading institutions of the United States, the UK governments, the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, they are all proceeding on the basis of basically this first option I mentioned concerning the image of man. That man is a parasite, a pollutant, a burden to nature. And please read the first quote, or show the first quote. Um, this is from Kurt Schwab. He has written a new book called Stakeholder Capitalism. And in that book, he actually admits that the neoliberal system is a failed system, something which was basically announced 50 years ago, prognosed by my late husband. And what they mean by neoliberal system is that paradigm which occurred for the last 50 years, which included to outsource production into cheap labor markets, to have no more halts for production, but have trucks arrive just in time, by going public on the stock exchange. And now, naturally, it is quite clear that with the supply lines all collapsing, that they want to have a new model. So what Klaus Schwab says in this book, he says, after discussing the economic infrastructure development details from Ethiopia, how railroads were developed, agricultural gains, the Grand Renaissance Dam built, even renewable energies, he insisted that this all had to stop. And he said, the kind of development being undertaken in Ethiopia reveals the central conundrum of the combat against climate change. He says, and now comes the important quote, the same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. The emissions that lead to climate change are not just the result of a selfish generation of industrialists or Western baby boomers. They are the consequence of the desire to create a better future for oneself. Now that is quite something. Basically what he says is that any attempt to overcome underdevelopment, to overcome poverty, to create a better life, is what destroys nature. So naturally he calls it a conundrum, an unsolvable paradox. So that is why he wants to have now a new model called stakeholder capitalism. And what that is supposed to be is, the ominous name is dematerialized growth. So there should be no longer investment in physical economy, in financial entitles instead, in CO2 emission trade, which is practically a non-existing thing, and you pay money so that you can produce so that others do not produce, like the developing countries. To make money by speculating on non-investment of others. Then they have this new thing, the nebulous ESG, Environment, Social Government, and that is about, everything you can imagine, but it has nothing to do with production. So what that means is, if this policy of the stakeholder capitalism is being implemented, and that is being pushed right now actively by the EU Commission, by the UK and US governments, it means the deindustrialization of the so-called advanced sector. It means the complete destruction of the Mittelstand, because it makes energy and many other raw materials so expensive that they are unpayable. It for sure means the impoverishment of masses of population. It means more billionaires. It increases the gap between the very rich and the very poor. And it absolutely means no development for the developing sector, which in practice means a massive population reduction for Africa, Latin America, large parts of Asia, and even pockets of third world kind conditions in the United States or in Europe. Now, this is the intended takeover of a Malthusian world order, the idea to have the Malthusian world outlook, to take over all institutions of the world, to create a world government which is run by such a regime. Now, let's look at what Malthusianism actually is and where it comes from. It goes back to the British East India Company, and you cannot think about that outlook without taking into account the practice of the African slave trade, the opium wars against China, the whole colonial policy against Africa, India, Latin American countries. Now let's look at the quote of Thomas Malthus, what he wrote in the essay of the Principle of Population. All children who are born, he says, beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level, must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. We should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Now, what this Malthusian policy, which was the policy of the British Empire, actually characterizes since then is an extreme form of Calvinism, which means, that if you are rich, that proves God is on your side because he has selected you. You do not have any need to have compassion with the poor because it's God's choice that you are among the privileged. There are many other writers other than Malthus. There was Jeremy Bentham, who wrote this Defense of Usury, Bernard Mandeville, who had the incredible theory that private crime, private vice, is necessary to stimulate the economy and leads to public good. For example, if you have a murderer, this is very good for the economy because that means the murderer eventually needs a lawyer who makes money. You need a judge, you need a court, and all of these contribute to the well-being of society, the public good. Now, naturally, all these writings are complete, lies and just a cover story, but nevertheless. Then you have John Stuart Mill, who basically developed the idea of utilitarianism, namely that the usefulness is the only criteria in everything which concerns society and the economy. Naturally, this goes along with unbelievable racism, not just racism practically against the poorer classes, but a racism naturally against all colored people. And look at this quote of Bertrand Russell, who wrote in The Impact of Science on Society in 1951, quote, "The white population of the world still will soon cease to increase. The Asiatic races will no longer, and the Negroes still longer, before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their number stable without help of war and pestilence. I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. There are others. which one must suppose opponents of birth control would prefer. War, as I remarked a moment ago, has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove to be effective. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. There would be nothing in this to offend the conscience of the devout or to restrain the ambition of nationalists. The state of affairs may be somewhat unpleasant, but of what? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other peoples. Now, this was obviously the immediate basis for what Prince Philip had to say, who was the founder of the Wildlife Fund. And if you want to know one of the major reasons why the development of the developing countries is so absolutely non-existent, you make a list of how many projects of bridges, of dams, of railroads were not built because the World Wildlife Fund basically discovered an insect which was about to disappear if a bridge would be built there. So Prince Philip said, quote, "You cannot keep a bigger flock of sheep than you are capable of feeding." In other words, conservation may involve culling in order to keep a balance between the relative numbers of each species within any particular habitat. I realize this is a very touchy subject, but the fact remains that mankind is part of the living world. Each new field that is cultivated means another field that is withheld from wild species. Now, naturally, wild species are more important than the human species. And the same Prince Philip, in an interview with People's Magazine in 1981, answered to the question, what do you think is the greatest threat to the environment? Philip: human population growth is probably the greatest long-term threat to survival. We are facing a major catastrophe if it's not contained, not only for the natural world, but also for the human world. The more people there are, the more resources they will consume, the more pollution they will cause, the more battles they will fight. We have no other choice. It is not voluntarily controlled. If it's not voluntarily controlled, it will involuntarily be controlled by the increase in disease, hunger, and war. In the event that I'm reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation. Now, then a major other one is from Dennis Meadows. Dennis Meadows, if you remember, was one of the two authors of the famous book Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome, which was published by the Club of Rome or promoted by it, which basically had the ridiculous thesis, that the resources are limited, and that therefore, we have sort of developed up to this point, which was 1972, and now we have reached an asymptotic barrier and have to go to zero growth and reduction of growth. And he said, quote, "No, even 7 billion people are too many for this planet. If everyone is allowed to have the full potential of mobility, nutrition and self-development, it will be 1 or 2 billion. Now, immediately, this was very much what characterizes the organization, the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization, because, my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, already in the 70s or starting with the late 60s, had development plans for Africa, which was a full development plan for the entire continent of Africa, with infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, energy production, distribution, communication. And, basically, if that would have been implemented, which we had many efforts to accomplish, Africa would be today the most developed continent with the most flowering agriculture industries. We worked on a 40-year development plan, working together with Indira Gandhi in the beginning of the 80s. We worked on Latin American integration with President Lopez Portillo. And because we were working on all of that even before the Club of Rome developed this limits to growth perspective, we had a very clear idea how easy it would be to transform these continents and make them livable for every human being on this planet. And therefore, when the Club of Rome promoted this Limits to Growth book, it was clear to us this was an onslaught from the side of the oligarchy. And Lyndon LaRouche immediately wrote a counter book with the title "There Are No Limits to Growth," which is a scientific discussion of why resources are only limited when you stay on the same level of technology, and that it is uniquely human creativity which redefines what is a resource, and that is essentially a limitless process, and it is not limited to the planet Earth. It involves the entire universe, as we have now demonstrated by space missions bringing back materials from the moon. Soon we will have helium-3 imported from the moon to produce fusion power on Earth. We are now talking about taking resources from asteroids. There are now plans to have a village on the moon, cities on Mars. So it's very clear that this whole conception of the limits to growth was based on a fraud. It was basically a computer model of linear functions, leaving out the most important aspect, namely that the definition of what a resource is will be always changed by inventions of new physical principles which redefine scientific and technological methods being used in the production process. So we countered that from the very beginning. And I created an organization, sort of the predecessor of the Schiller Institute, which I called the Club of Life, for the defense of life on this planet against these imperialists. Now, just to give you one more quote from somebody who wrote a disgusting book called The Population Bomb, Paul Ehrlich. What he says is, a cancer is an uncontrolled multiplication of cells. The population explosion is an uncontrolled multiplication of people. Treating only the symptoms of cancer may make the victim more comfortable at first, but eventually he dies, often horribly. A similar fate awaits a world with a population explosion if only the symptoms are treated. We must shift our efforts from treatment of the symptoms to the cutting off of the cancer. The operation will demand many apparently brutal and heartless decisions. The pain may be intense, but the disease is so far advanced that only with a radical surgery does the patient have a chance for survival. And then he says in an interview with The Guardian, how many of you support depend on lifestyles? We came up with 1.5 to 2 billion because you can have big active cities and wilderness. If you want a battery chicken world where everyone has a minimum space and food and everyone is kept just about alive, you might be able to support in the long term about 4 to 5 billion people. But you already have 7 billion. So we have to humanely and as rapidly as possible move to population shrinkage. So that is the bestial view, and I give you one last quote from Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, who is one of the absolute gurus of the British Empire. He always wants to be only called commander of the British Empire, and he was the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Consequences, and later became the advisor of the Vatican Academy of Sciences and was very influential on the recent encyclicals of Pope Francis. So he wrote at the 2009 climate conference, quote, "In a very cynical way, it's a triumph for science because at last we have stabilized something, namely the estimates for the carrying capacity of the planet, namely below 1 billion people." Now, here we go, below 1 billion people, but we already have about 8 billion now. And so what is the plan of these people, how to do away with the so-called superfluous eaters? I mean, we had that already once 80 years ago. Well, Greta Thunberg said the problem started in Great Britain, and what she meant is the beginning of the industrialization in Great Britain. Now, so, well, let's look at what is the real fight between these two images of man and forms of society. Around the same time, at the late part of the 18th century, where these really evil ideas of the Malthusians developed, around the same time, Friedrich Schiller, the German poet of freedom, wrote a very important article called "The Legislation of Lycurg and Solon." And there he contrasted the model of the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta and that of Athens as the two fundamental models of society which are in absolute contradiction, based on the corresponding two images of man, what I said in the beginning, man as an expendable parasite which can be killed off if there are too many, or man as the highest expression in the universe. And in this case, Schiller very presciently understood that Sparta was really the basic model for this oligarchical system, the basis for modern day Malthusianism. In this case, Lycurg, the ruler, had organized the state in such a way that, if you look at it in the first view, everything looks well organized, everything is for the benefit of the elite, the state. But if you look a little bit closer, you see that they actually have slaves, which they called helots. And if there are too many of those, you can actually kill them off and train your youth shooting these helots until they are culled, as I think it was Philip said is legitimate to do. And this he contrasts with Solon and the wise laws of the city of Solon. And when Solon, according to Schiller, was asked what is the purpose of society, he said progression, that all citizens develop in the best possible way. Now, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a very beautiful article in the 70s already, which is called "The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites," where he confronts exactly these two models. And again, I would recommend this as reading material. Now, the Great Reset is actually based on this imperial model. It is maybe, looking more modern. It uses slightly different categories and notions, but it is an exact copy of earlier oligarchical models, which have a long tradition, which have been existing for at least the last 3,000 years, 5,000 years. And one can actually trace back the modern liberalism directly to the pantheism of earlier oligarchical societies, which always were based on parasitical usury for the benefit of an elite of an upper class, which treated the mass of the population as cattle. Now, they were always based on a Mother Earth cult, exactly like the greenies, like the ecologists, or these nature people who treat nature and climate as a new form of religion. And this cult appeared in the earliest different civilizations. And you always had a Mother Earth kind of god on the one side, and then you mostly had a male god, which was mostly in the form of a phallus symbol or a snake. So in the Harappa Dravidian civilization, which was about 2,500 to 1,700 before Christ, you had the goddess Shakti. On the male side, you had the god Shiva. Please show the picture. Then in the Chaldean civilization, you had Ishtar. Then in the Sheba Ethiopian civilization, you had Atta. In the Canaan civilization, Astarte. In the Hellenic Egyptian, you had Isis on the female side and Osiris on the male side. In the Phrygian civilization, you had Cybele, and on the male side, Dionysos. And finally, in the ancient Greek cult of Delphi, you had the Mother Earth god Gaia, and on the male side, you had Python. Now, so what is the common characteristic of all these early gods and later the gods of Olympus in the Greek mythology was that they were completely arbitrary. They would rule according to their whims. They would not give laws which you could rationally understand, but they would make rules, like an early rules-based society, where they would basically always look for the advantage of the ruling elites, and they would basically control men whom they regarded as being controlled by hedonistic impulses, and therefore, in order to control these masses, you had to manipulate these hedonistic impulses. This happened in all empires, in the Roman Empire, the circus, the amphitheaters, to have the Christians eaten by lions, to bring out the worst in people. The worse they are, the better you could control them. What is common to all of these Mother Earth cults is a cyclical world outlook. There is no progress. There is the eternal return of the same. And, it took mankind an enormous struggle to break through and break loose from this kind of irrational domination of an oligarchy. Now, it is very fascinating to study how in the history of mankind, man did break free, and the first major such breakthrough was actually the Greek poet or author Homer. In the Iliad, and he discusses also how Odysseus, in his travel, challenges the arbitrary rule of these gods. So this was the first time that man, at least in literature, which is still available, was able to free himself of this irrational control. The next major step was the trilogy Prometheus by the Greek poet Aeschylus, of which only parts are still transmitted, but very clearly you can read there about the beautiful image of Prometheus as one of the gods which basically separated from, he was a half god, separated from the gods of Olympus by bringing fire to man. And there are some beautiful descriptions, if you read that Prometheus, the piece, how fire enabled man to make higher conquering of nature, how this developed, to have better food, to have better living conditions, and naturally why Zeus hated Prometheus for having brought this technology to man, and that is why he has chained him to this rock, and this bird is picking his liver for eternity. Quite a brutal punishment. But the Promethean man corresponds very clearly to the idea of man, the most advanced figure in existence in the universe. Then major next step in the liberation of man was the ideas of Socrates and Plato. What is the significance of especially Plato, naturally, is that the collected dialogues of Plato and writings of Plato, Socrates is only quoted there, was to show man for the first time in a coherent fashion that man is not hedonistic, that man is the only species which is capable of ideas, that the ideas are the real existence, and the world of sense certainty is only the world of shadows, the kind of shadows you see as if you are sitting in a dark cage where the light from outside the cave is throwing shadows on the wall of the cave. So what you perceive as the shadow is not reality, but reality is outside of the cave of sense perception. Now, this was a major step forward, and still one step beyond that was the emergence of Jesus Christ, of Christianity, because here you had for the first time the idea of man in the image of God, the Creator. Now, since God is limitless, in perfection, in power, omniscient, man in the image of the Creator is himself, not just an image, but as Nicolaus of Cusa would later say, imago viva Dei, in a living image. The image is living image of God. And therefore, the cyclical world outlook with Christ has been absolutely broken through forever. And it is the advantage and merit of Augustinus, who a couple of centuries later wrote that the affinity between Platonism and Christianity is such that you find in Plato a lot of the things which were revealed later by Christianity, which means Augustinus concludes that creative reason is able to identify what is being revealed. With other words, there is no contradiction between creative reason and belief. And this is a very important tradition in European philosophy, those who believe that there is a cohesion between science and religion, as compared to those who only believe that you can only trust the revealed word, which is completely separate and above science and knowledge, which you find today in the United States being a big controversy. Now, there was a book which was written in 1949, immediately after the Second World War and the Nazi period, by an author called Armin Mohler. He wrote a book called The Conservative Revolution. And this is a very important book because he describes how conservation, which is another word for this ecology outlook, that it was a counter movement against the ideas of 1776 and 1789, meaning, the American Revolution and the idea of the Republic by a variety of conservative movements. And there were 400 such tendencies. One of them became the Nazis. So in this book, Armin Mohler makes a very important observation where he quotes various authors and basically says what happened with Christianity was that for the first time, the idea of the cyclical world outlook was interrupted for good, because with the emergence of Christ, being both man and God, and the idea of every man in the image of God, which came to men through the person of Jesus Christ, you had for the first time the overcoming detonation of the cyclical world outlook, because it introduced the idea of the limitless perfection of man. This is actually very interesting because at one conference called Religion and Environment, Prince Philip actually said very explicit, referring to the cyclical world picture, he said that in order to protect the environment and in order to protect nature, one should go back to the pre-Christian mythologies, to the Mother Earth idea, to Gaia, to the cyclical world outlook, because only if you think in this way that you can accomplish the goals of environmentalism. Now, this oligarchical form of society, where a small elite would be, running things over masses which were kept as backward as possible, where only the privileges of nobility and, the upper class, the royals, the kings, the barons, the counts and so forth would be protected. That was, at least for most of the European history, some forms of Asian history, and one would have to look at Asian history, Chinese history, a little bit different. But those were the governmental forms which were dominant practically everywhere until the 15th century. Now, the first time you had governments which were not dominated by such oligarchical forms occurred in the Italian Renaissance. Already before, you had here and there small forms of urban development, which, the role of science and crafts improved the living conditions for people a little bit. But the real big break came with the golden Italian Renaissance, where very explicitly now the role of scientific and technological progress, the increase of education, this was helped a little bit later also by Gutenberg and the printing press, which in Europe only appeared in the 15th century. In China it was earlier. An increased living standard as a result of this application of science and technology. The longevity increased. You had great artistic breakthroughs. You had the emergence of the sovereign nation state. Now this is very, very important because up to the 15th century, you had always imperial forms of government. You had emperors, you had, czars, you had kings. Even so, the very idea of kingdom was already a step forward from the standpoint of empire. And if you study the long thousands of years of emergence of the nation state, it is very fascinating, and you can see that the image of man and the form of government actually went parallel. Now, Nicolaus of Cues was the first one to formulate this principle of a sovereign nation state in the Concordancia Catholica, where he basically said that you need, for a good government, you need the consensus of the governed, and you need a reciprocal legal relationship between the governors and the governed, where basically a representative has to represent both the interest of the state and those who are governed in a reciprocal way. That is why the Republican system of government is superior to a pure democracy, and why the sovereign government is the only form of government where, especially in times of crisis, the interest of the people can be protected, and why all forms of supranational government are in the interest of this oligarchy, because you have no way how to protect the interest of the people. Now, at the same time of the Italian Renaissance, you had a similar tendency in France under the rulership of Louis XI, in which in 20 years of his rule, there was a doubling of the living standard, and naturally a watershed breakthrough of this tendency was the American Revolution, where for the first time you had the establishment of a republic. You had a constitution where the preamble already said that the common good is what gives legitimacy to the government, not only for the present, but also to future generations. Now, there was from the very beginning that this sovereign nation state idea devoted to the common good emerged in the 15th century. There was always a drive to destroy any other form of society which would be based on the investment in scientific progress to increase the productivity of the productive powers. Now, in the case of the Italian Renaissance, it was Venice, the Venetian Empire, which immediately started to factionalize, to throw unrest and friction. And this fight between the oligarchical model, the empire which shifted its headquarters. Empires and people who belong to empires have no legal, they have no national loyalties, but they always work together on an international level. And they don't really care if the headquarters of the empire is in Rome, in Byzantium, in Persia, in Venice, in Holland, in Great Britain, because they shift according to how things go, and there are what Lyndon LaRouche called a slime mold, which may change like the color and form of a champignon. Slime mold, but it remains the same no matter if it's green, brown, stinks or not. So this fight between that form of society and the sovereign republic has been the principal fight for the last 600 years. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, there was the beginning of what would be called modern political economics on the European continent. And it was known at that time under the name of cameralism, and major contributing thinkers were Cardinal Richelieu, Mazarin, Colbert, and Leibniz. Now, Leibniz was the first to develop the idea of physical economy, of the role of scientific and technological progress in increasing productivity. And in a very small but important writing called Society and Economy, he talks about the role of academies to take care of social justice, of the development of labor power as the only source of wealth, of the importance to have a full manufacture in every country to be basically self-sufficient in terms of all supply lines, you would say nowadays, to go for a higher qualification of all apprentices to become masters themselves as quickly as possible. And the main rule of the academy, he said, is to spread love and trust among the members. So when you look at certain modern textbooks about the theory of Leibniz, what do they say? They say that he developed the ideal of an authoritarian welfare state with a metaphysical intention where the statecraft coheres with a divine service, and the aim is to further the mental development and morality of the members of society. Now, obviously, the idea that the economy should be in cohesion with the creation, the laws of the universe, and the moral development of the people, that is obviously the exact opposite of the hedonistic conception of the British imperialist faction, which we discussed before. Now, nothing is more feared by the oligarchy than a state that is furthering the moral and intellectual development of its citizen, which obviously is the basis of sovereignty, because only if you have well-educated, creative, and therefore free citizens that a country can be sovereign. Now, this is the real reason why you have right now such an incredible campaign against China. And why China is portrayed as the absolute enemy, opponent, competitor, adversary, and why all the think tanks of the mainstream media and many governments and politicians are regarding China as the absolute threat. I can tell you from my own experience with China, which goes back to 1971, and all I'm saying about China, I have come to the conclusion on the basis of my own investigation and observation, and I'm not talking about something I have read, I'm talking about something I have looked at in detail for now about 40 years, and I can tell you that China is not aggressive, they are not imperial, they're not trying to replace the unipolar world of the Anglo-Americans, they're not trying to coerce people, they're trying to create a new system of win-win collaboration, of what Xi Jinping calls community of a shared future of humanity. So why is this such a threat? While China has for the last 30 years, 40, but especially the last 30 years, made the most incredible development you have ever seen. It's an unprecedented historical civilizational accomplishment because they have lifted 850 million of their own people out of poverty. The Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, is now cooperating with about 150 countries, who many of those have now for the first time the chance to overcome poverty left by the colonial powers. Now, if you think about the first quote of Klaus Schwab, which I read to you, the fact that China is putting such a great emphasis on the intellectual and moral improvement of its citizen. Xi Jinping talks about the need to have an aesthetic education for all students to produce a beautiful mind, because only a beautiful mind can be the source of new great works of art. Then you understand why they regard China as such a threat, because they are teaching literally millions and millions of students to become scientists, to become teachers, to become great artists, to improve morally and intellectually. Now, that is exactly the opposite of what the Klaus Schwab model is. So that is why Putin is absolutely right when he, in a just given speech at the Valdai Club, this is a club of intellectuals which meets, I think, several times a year, or at least one time in a big conference, where he basically said, a speech you should also read because it's a very important speech. He said, it is very clear that the current model of capitalism is not working, and that we are now entering a new era, that this is a transformation which is going on in the world of a completely different caliber. He talks about the likelihood that things will get much worse. He talks about a coming cataclysm, and that the usual approaches don't function. And he says, when the real crisis strikes, one value is left, and that is human life. Life is the absolute value. So I, completely independent of Putin, who made that speech 2 days ago, wrote about 2 weeks ago or so a wake-up call, which most of you probably have read by now, where I, in the first part, discuss that people should not just look at this phenomena or that phenomena, this part of the crisis which concerns them, that all the different things which are going wrong on the planet, from the hunger to the inability of countries to have vaccines for the COVID, the hyperinflation, all of these things are symptoms of the fact that this system is collapsing. And that therefore, Mr. Berkut and I issued this wake-up call, which should become the unifying point of departure to create an anti-Malthusian resistance of many, many forces in the world who oppose this present, attack on the value of life as it is expressed by the Schwabs and Phillips and Schellenhubers of this world. Now, I, in this wake-up call, after describing the present situation, developed a couple of points which I think should be the points of discussion among many, many forces in the world, because we need to agree what image of man is the one we accept. And therefore, let me read to you these principles, which I think are very basic and should be the starting point. Man is the only species endowed with creative reason, which distinguishes him from all other living beings. This creative capability enables him to continually discover new principles of the physical universe, which is called scientific progress. The fact that the human mind, through an immaterial idea, is able to discover these principles, which then have an effect on the material universe in the form of technological progress, proves that there is a correspondence between the lawfulness of the human mind and the laws of the physical universe. Second, just as the spatial expanse and anti-entropic evolution of the universe are infinite, so is the intellectual and moral perfectibility of the human mind. Therefore, every additional human being is a new source for further development of the universe and for the solution of the problems on Earth, such as overcoming poverty, disease, underdevelopment, and violence. Taking care of each other is key in this ongoing development. It is the combination of creativity and empathy that transcends mere day-to-day exigencies. Third, scientific and technological progress has a positive effect in that when applied to the production process, it increases the productivity of the labor force and the individual and agricultural capacities, which in turn leads to the rising living standard and a longer life expectancy for more and more people. A prosperous physical economy is the precondition for the positive development of the common good, providing not only the elites, but all the people with quality food, clean water, affordability and modern healthcare, quality education, modern communication, and above all, cheap and sufficient energy with high energy flux densities. Inherently safe third-generation nuclear energy and future use of thermonuclear fusion are indispensable for securing mankind's energy supply for an unlimited time. Unreliable energy systems and increasing energy prices are the mother of inflation. Poverty starts with energy poverty. Fourth, the purpose of the economy has nothing to do with profit, but with the happiness of people, in the sense meant by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, meaning that the people are able to develop all the inherent potentials they have into a harmonious whole, and thus contribute to the best possible further development of mankind. Or as the wise Solon of Essen said, the purpose of mankind is progress. It is the duty of good government through its policies to provide for the happiness of its citizens in this sense, beginning with universal education for all, the goal of which must be to foster beautiful character through education and the development of an ever-increasing number of geniuses. This perspective is in accordance with Vladimir Vernadsky's conviction that the physical universe must inherently evolve in such a way that the share of the noosphere increasingly grows in relation to the biosphere. To be more specific, growth should be twofold: creativity for the material necessities and empathy for the immaterial needs. Taking care of each other and our natural environment is presented in our slogan, Prosperity for All, in which all refers not only to us in the here and now, but also to future generations. Fifth, man's true destiny is not to remain an earthling. His identity as the only known species endowed with creative reason is to explore space, as we did with planet Earth, when space pioneer Kraft Ericke called what he called the extraterrestrial imperative, or in a certain sense, the new educational effect of space travel on man, requires mankind to truly grow up. That is, to cast off his irrational impulses and make creativity his identity, which so far has only been the case for outstanding scientists and artists of classical culture. In this phase of evolution, of love for humanity and love for creation, generated by the recognition of the magnificence of the physical universe, it will have become natural that mankind takes care of all aspects of humanity, the planet, nature, and the universe at large, with great care, because the fabricated contradiction between man and nature will have been overcome with a new stewardship. Man does not exist in opposition to nature. He is the most advanced part of it. That is what Schiller called freedom in necessity, and it is the concept that Beethoven placed above his Große Fuge, just as rigorous as it is free. This lofty idea of man and everything he has built is what is threatened by the Hjalmar Schachts, Klaus Schwabs, and the power-hungry political leaders and the profit-hungry business leaders of the world. This is a wake-up call, addressed to all people, to resist the danger of a new evil. Let us prevent a return to the past, when an evil elite impoverished mankind and told us to be happy with such a condition. Now that is what we should discuss.